Hi guys, today we're going to be looking at entity blueprints. So an entity is um, pretty much any object in the game. It includes environmental objects, projectiles, um, infantry, vehicles, uh, props such as the heavy machine guns and mortars, emplacements. Everything, pretty much everything has an entity blueprint. The only exception to this um, is your abilities upgrades. They don't have entity blueprints, but they use entity blueprints in most cases. If you call in an airstrike, um, it's basically creating a plane entity, and it's telling it to go to a certain point, which is your target, and then that plane is being told to fire, and when it fires, it's creating its own projectile entities um, as it's instructed to do so. Um, in a infantry themselves, each individual infantry is an entity. However, the squad itself is separate. Um, Also, as well, a vehicle such as a tank or a jeep or whatever, uh, it has its own entity and it has its own squad. There's only one tank there, but it's still considered a squad because of how the engine basically controls it. The idea is an entity might not be interactable or behave in any way um, without being specifically told to, whereas the squad blueprint will um, not so much think for itself, but it's much more alive in comparison. Um, okay, so let's have a look at what's in the average infantry entity blueprint. The first thing we have up here is the ability extension. So the ability extension basically includes all abilities that that entity might be able to use. In the case of a squad ability, in the case of a squad, uh, you'll see here, throw grenade, throw sticky bombs on a rifleman. It's set on the individual rifleman and not on the squad, yet the abilities still come up in the squad. That's because the way it's set up is to show the abilities that all entities within the squad can use. However, if you had a squad that consisted of two different types of entities, one type could use the ability, the other type couldn't. If the entity that could use the ability died, the squad would no longer be able to use that ability due to that entity not being there. The other entities which don't have that ability would not be able to cover for it. Whereas if you looked in a squad blueprint under their ability area, any person in the squad could potentially use that ability. So yeah, that's all that is just a reference directly to the ability itself. Everything that the ability itself does is in that abilities file. Action apply extension, these are all actions which are performed when the entity is created, basically. So in this case, it's using a set state under the critical actions, and it's telling it to do a specific variation, which will be explained more later. But basically, it's just saying when you're created, I want you to change this. If you want a unit to be created and have a specific upgrade, it'd be done under an upgrade action. They're all under here somewhere, but that'll be explained later. Attention extension, that's, yeah, it's not a huge thing, it's pretty straightforward. Should it face a target when it has its attention? Yes or no. For tanks, it's no. For vehicles and infantry which need to face directly at a target, it'll pretty much always be yes. Simply because a tank has a rotating turret, whereas an infantryman will, if an infantryman's upper half of their body rotated 90 degrees to shoot at something, it'd look wrong. Whereas in a tank, it's to be expected. Burn extension is basically there's not a lot of it in there, but that's for exposure to incendiary damage. So it's how much damage it takes when exposed to fire. Does it change to another entity when it's exposed to fire? Is it flame proof? Does it have a minimum tolerance to flame? If it dies from fire damage, does it act differently? So in this case, no, it doesn't. It just dies normally. But potentially you could, if you had a vehicle die from fire damage, you could make it explode differently, theoretically. Casualty extension is to do with when that entity dies. So in this case, when it becomes a casualty, it's got a sight radius modifier. So sight radius goes down to 5%. You lose control short after, but basically that lets you see your wounded soldier. So yeah, what do they do when they get revived? What do they do while they're being revived or reviving someone else? I'll have to check that. What's the most time it will take them to die? What's the least time it will take them to die? This just gives a bit of a variation, so you don't have 3 soldiers die and they get wounded rather and become a casualty. That they don't all time out at exactly the same time. It's to add a bit more realism, I suppose. On rescue actions, so what that happens when they get picked up. Permanent casualty, if that's set to true, basically it means they can't be picked up. They'll be a casualty for forever, basically. They won't die, they'll always be a casualty. Wounded, the splatfile name is just applies a random splat, which is just a texture. In most cases it's just blood, and basically it just applies to it while it's a casualty. Splat seconds after death, tells you how long until it applies that. So it will basically, when it becomes a casualty, they won't necessarily be covered in blood. After they've died for a certain amount of time, it'll create that splat. UI timeline, I've got no idea what that is. Combat extension is where all your weapons information is stored. So in this case, we come down to here and we can see that they have a M1 Garand assigned. Parent hardpoint simply refers, basically if a hardpoint is parented to another hardpoint, it'll target the same target. So if hardpoint 1 is parented to target hardpoint 2, it'll target the same target that hardpoint 2 is targeting. This is used mostly in tanks so that the coaxial machine gun, the machine gun on the turret is shooting at the same target as the turret, basically. Reject attack command basically says, how to put it, more or less says that it can't be given a command. It will attack by itself, but it can't be told to attack. Can scavenge, not can scavenge, I think, is designed for basically picking up weapons of a sort, whether or not it can, not so much using weapons like slot items, but rather can it change its own hardpoints without being told to. It's not something that's worth stuffing around with. Okay, so cost extension is where all the unit costs are. So cost of resources, how long it takes to build, Scavenge percentage returns. Not really something to worry about. Upkeep, that's just a multiplier to affect the manpower rate. So in this case, for every infantry rifleman you have, you get a 0.5% decrease to your manpower rate. Cover extension, how it acts in each cover. So in a heavy case, so I'm in heavy cover, I take this action to play a different animation. Does being heavy cover prevent anything? Safety value, so half as it takes half damage. Speed multiplier, does it change speed? So light, we got a safety value on light. It's actually lower than heavy because it has it's basically, it's not as safe. Does that make sense? Negative is minus 0.3. This is an increase to damage you take. Everything else is basically a 0 because it doesn't influence how much damage they take. Crushee means they can be crushed by tanks and the like, and what will it do when it gets crushed? Basically, when it gets crushed, its max speed gets changed. That's basically it for an infantry. Engineering is basically construction. So in this case, it's saying that it can build from that construction menu right there, which in this case is reinforcing capture points, basically. Actions to perform while it's constructing, etc. Entity blueprint, this contains the visual information. So in this case we're saying that its active blueprint can be found at models by default, races, allies, soldiers, riflemen. And here we have the rifleman active blueprint. All your animators specifically go from that models file. Yeah, is it visible or not? Is it always revealed in Fog of War? They're pretty self-explanatory. Use collision mesh. Yeah, you don't really worry about that too much unless you know what you're doing. Basically, for infantry, it's bad because it checks based on, rather than another collision setup, it will specifically check for collisions with that infantry's mesh, which in the case of an infantry can get very messy, considering it uses rifle meshes and stuff like that and other weapons. Health extension, does it get an elevation bonus? Can it be repaired? Cuttable basically only really applies to wrecks, whether they can be destroyed or not. Damage table is basically, do we have any multipliers based on how much health they have? Death actions, what do they do when they die? What's the name of the death event that is related to a state set in the object editor? So if you don't know what you're doing, don't touch it. How long it takes to die officially? Does it delete when dead? Yes or no? How many hit points does it have? Is it invincible? Is it a salvageable wreck? Does the wreck remain owned by the player? Can it be damaged from the rear? If so, how does it take damage from the rear? When it gets repaired, does it change entity? When it gets repaired, does it change squad? When it gets rebuilt, does it always rebuild into the original owners? If that's true, and this is false, if something dies, it will become owned by World, and then when it gets rebuilt, it will still be owned by World, so it'll be completely useless. Basically, if one's going to be true, you want both to be true. Does it get a modifier from being in cover? Does it regenerate health? Is health regeneration disabled? Usually if that's 0, it will be false. If that's not 0 and that's true, the idea is that you can enable regeneration within specific areas, or under specific conditions. Does it get removed from pathfinding on death? Basically, for infantry, that'll pretty much always be true, because infantry will always be able to step over infantry and vehicles will always be able to drive over the top. In the case of a tank, that'll probably be false, because it will force other vehicles and infantry to go around. When it dies, can everyone see it? Can it be scuttled? It's not really worth playing around with. And when it, for infantry, it's not really a thing to worry about. But for vehicles, they'll have a wreck entity, and basically what it is just another entity blueprint that's specific. That's specifically a wreck. A lot of vehicles you don't need to have a wreck entity, but if you want it to specifically be different, so for example, if you wanted a tank to be destroyed, become a wreck, and then when it's rebuilt, it's rebuilds as a different version of the tank. It's damaged, the turret doesn't work or something like that, then you can effectively create a wreck entity which is the tank with the damaged turret. Then when it gets rebuilt, and then in that particular entity you'll set it up so that when it's rebuilt it becomes itself, and then you just simply set it up so it's a tank with no working turret. If that all makes sense. Okay, hit object is basically what do I do when I get hit? Fairly straightforward. Can objects pass through me if they hit me? Most cases that's false. It's a human. The hit percentage, that's as a decimal value, so that's actually 100%. But that's basically 100% of hits that hit him will be hits. Projectile pass through, types of projectiles which will pass through. Basically, the idea of this is stickies and throws are passed through because infantry will need to throw them. Artillery's passed through because it needs to hit the ground to go off. Homing and homing infantry are passed through because they're used by infantry again. These are not passed through because they're designed to hit and kill infantry, basically. Line of sight extension is for using line of sight. Blocking blocks is not something to really worry about. Basically, it's for blocking line of sight to some extent. So how much line of sight does that object block? For infantry, they don't block any line of sight. Does it block shots? And does it use a blocking box? For infantry, that's all false. For a vehicle, you could potentially have it as a yes, is shot blocking, so the infantry can't shoot through the tank. They have to walk around the tank before they can shoot. Stuff like that. And then you'd set the blocking box up so it was roughly the same size as the tank. Although then at the same time, the tank would block line of sight. Modifiers, these are just constant modifiers. They modify, you can modify damage. Modifiers pretty self-explanatory. Modifier extension means that it can have modifiers. Modifier applying is just applying modifiers. Moving, how fast does it accelerate, how fast does it decelerate. -1 means it goes straight to max speed, basically. It goes 0 to 3 instantaneously. Does it get oriented to terrain? Infantry don't, because they don't. Well, you don't lean backwards as you walk up hills. Tanks and vehicles do. Pass type, I wouldn't. It can be fun to play around with, but it's a very advanced thing to do. How quickly does it rotate? How quickly does it rotate when crouched? How quickly does it rotate when prone? How quickly does it rotate when it's standing? Do you want a smooth path or basically a jerky path? A jerkier path will, rather than trying for a straight line, will go at more angles. Speed, turn plane, turns like a human, so it just turns on the spot. Tanks and vehicles Tanks basically turn like people, they turn on the spot. Vehicles, jeeps, specifically have a minimum turn radius basically. Population extension, how much population does it use? Posture extension. No, it's not something to worry about. Sight extension, how far can they see? Can they detect camouflage? How far can they detect camouflage? How long is the area revealed for when they die? Do they get a elevation bonus to their sight radius, etc.? Sim entity, don't worry about too much. Team weapon user means that they can use team weapons, such as mortars, heavy machine guns. Type gets treated as infantry, according to those weapons. It's considered infantry, and it's considered a builder as well. UI extension, this is where all your tooltip stuff and everything's kept. Where are we? For entities that don't have tooltip, all this is set to 0 because it's an entity, not a squad. They have no help text. Whereas they still have a screen name. This is what comes up when it's moused over as an individual unit. These numbers correspond to an entry in what's called a UCS file. And basically it's just a list of numbers and the text that is associated with those numbers. Selection name, basically everyone with the same selection name will get selected when you double click on it. Not really worried about an entity blueprints, that's more so under squad. Selection type, squad select, so when you select it, it selects a squad. Sloppy select means can you drag around, hit one entity, will it select it? So basically you drag over one entity, it'll select the whole squad. Information about its speech, that's where you'll find, where are we? It is, here we go, sound. I'm pretty sure. Speech. Single player. Multiplier? Multiplier. Yeah, it's under here somewhere. If you look around long enough, you'll find it. Group position and priority will be explained in the squad blueprints because that's where it really matters. Veterancy experience extension. How much is it worth to get killed? How much is it worth when it gets killed? It's basically when you kill it, you gain this much experience towards your next command point. When it dies, you gain that much experience. So if it's yours, that's how much experience you get when it dies. If it's not yours, that's how much experience you get when you kill it. And that covers an infantry entity blueprint. Once you start playing around with it, it all makes a lot more sense. But hopefully that gives you a rough idea of what you're looking at when you look at an entity blueprint. Thanks for watching.